All right, I think we're ready to go. Nicole, we're looking good.
We're missing Hanover County and DRPT and CTAC, Ms. Guthrie.
Okay. Well, hopefully they're able to join
Hey,
us.
Nicole.
Oh, someone's on the phone.
Here.
Thank you, Tiffany. So Tiffany's here.
Okay, great. Let's go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone to the RRTPO Public Transportation Work Group. My name is Chet Parsons. I am the Director of Transportation for Plan RVA, and we are happy to be hosting the meeting this morning with a primary focus on the Regional Public Transportation Plan that GRTC and their consultant team are putting together. We do have a couple of housekeeping items to take care of. I have Nicole Mueller with me this morning running the show, and I think that we can start. The statement regarding virtual meetings was included in your packet. It has not changed, and I don't believe we have had any questions or concerns about participation or lack of ability to participate, Nicole, so we can move forward with that. If anyone has questions about how to participate virtually, we would be happy to talk offline and figure out ways to accommodate any particular needs that folks might have. If we can, let's go ahead and take attendance by roll call, Nicole.
Yes, thank you. Good morning, everybody. I'll start with Chesterfield County, Ms. Smith.
Here.
City of Richmond, Ms. Clark.
Here.
Hanover County, Mr. Vidunas. Henrico County, Ms. Smidler.
Here.
CTAC, Ms. Guthrie. DRPT, Ms. Dubinsky.
Guthrie is present.
Thank you, Lisa.
Tiffany's here.
DRPT, Ms. Dubinsky. Thank you. GRTC, Ms. Torres.
Here.
Plan RVA, Mr. Lambs.
Here.
And Ride Finders, Mr. O'Keefe.
Here.
Thank you. That concludes the roll call for attendance.
Great, thanks, Nicole. This is a work group. We do not have a formal, as formal of a structure with this group as we do with other committees of Plan RVA and the TPO. So we will, any decisions that need to be made, we'll do by consensus. We do not have a chair or a vice chair, so I'll just facilitate the meeting. Are there any consideration of amendments to the agenda as it was distributed and presented today? Okay, hearing none, we can move on to item number 2, which is the meat of the discussion today. And I would turn it over to Adrienne and her team to talk about, I guess, next steps and findings for the Regional Public Transportation Plan.
Yeah, thanks, Chet. Good morning, everyone. Want to thank you all for participating in the core design. I believe that was last week where we spent 2 days. What we'll be doing today is, we had a special board meeting yesterday, kind of went over the process that we did in the core design. Some of you may have tuned in, and they did make a kind of policy resolution decision going off of what you guys recommended after we went through that whole thought pattern. So Scudder's going to get into that decision, what was made, and then we'll get into, we've been talking about enhancement all this time, so now we'll start the discussion of what it looks like for kind of the base network, how it looks with the CVTA funds, other revenue sources, as well as what local dollars look like. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn over to Scudder. He has a full presentation.
Would help if I unmuted. There we are. Good morning, everyone. Thank you again, as Adrienne says, for your time. Many of you were with us last week as we worked through the draft plan design through the core design retreat. And as Adrienne said, we had a good meeting with the board yesterday in that ridership coverage decision about how to split resources of CVTA and regional funding overall between ridership and coverage focus. They adopted a resolution that specified that the CVTA funds should primarily focus on ridership-oriented services, but that up to 15% of funding can support regionally significant coverage-oriented services. And that aligns with the effective split and what we drew together last week. And we went through in pretty good detail with them the decisions and discussions about where to go, which corridors to serve with more frequency or more coverage, and which ones did not get chosen between the coverage and the ridership scenarios. So I think the only what I would consider lower altitude specific routing item that maybe remained in question is discussion around trying to get to J. Sargent Reynolds on Parham with the Route 1 extension, which we will need to follow up with Henrico staff about that possibility and how that might get structured. But there seems to be significant interest in that. But that is ultimately a low altitude question, not really a function of the policy question here. And we do think there's probably enough time in the schedule to make that happen. It's just a function of how to actually do it. And who gets served first and who gets served last on that route, basically. So that means that the map we drew last week, which we have a draft map of at this regional scale, which of course is on the presentation is a little hard to see, but that map that we drew together last week is going to be the recommended map for this regional transit plan of what the network should look like when fully implemented with new service and expanded service. And we've all been through it together so often, I don't think I need to go through in excruciating detail all the decisions that were made, but I do just want to, for posterity's sake, list everything out here. One, so everyone can see the list of expansions and improvements in service that are planned in that map, but also just to sort of say, wow, this is actually a pretty useful, exciting, and positive list of transit improvements that you all are funding here over the next few years. So kudos to the region for finding the money in the CVTA funding to work together to do this. So I think a moment of excitement should be allowed for all of us with this. So I won't read off this entire list, but does anyone have any questions about the list of improvements, the map I just flipped through really quickly, which I can go through in more detail if anyone has any questions about those improvements? All right, hearing none, I will assume everyone understands them reasonably well at this point, and we can then start talking about the next really big question in this process, which is over the long term, how do we pay for all of this service? When we started this process in January, you'll recall we started this process with talking about financial projections of what could be afforded with the new funding. And so I want to go back to two slides that we talked about in January with you all and with the board about the projections over the next couple of fiscal years. These were kind of the starting point of thinking about what could you afford to do. In looking at FY 22, 23, and 24, the key element of these projections to focus on is this surplus, basically this difference. This is the projection of if you did not expand anything, if you just ran the system as it is today, and you had the CVTA revenues and you had the local revenues that you are projected to have for this fiscal year, which is approximately $8 million from the city, approximately $4 million from Henrico County, and a little over $1 million from Chesterfield, a lot of that coming from the DRPT grant for Route 1 service, or Route 111 service. How would things look over the next couple of fiscal years? And you would have a surplus, but a relatively small surplus, and a surplus that would be declining, in part because costs are rising a little faster than revenues. So the desire was, put out there that we really wanted to be able to say we can expand more than what, say, a $6 or $7 million surplus would afford. And part of the way to do that would be to spend this FY21 surplus, which is $20 million, because the CVTA money is, coming into the bank, but it's not really being spent yet. And we all talked about, the assumptions behind being able to do that over the next couple of fiscal years. That would be, a workable plan to spend down some of that surplus to help expand the system over the next few years, which would give you about $10 million a year, which would be enough to afford the network that we have drawn. But, beyond that, there's a point at which there's got to be funding to continue running that network, because operations is forever, effectively, unless you want to cut service. And so we need to have, everyone needs to be aware, and part of the discussion today is everyone being aware of what does that mean over the long term in terms of how to allocate costs, because the regional dollars will only grow by the tax revenue sources that they rely on, the gas tax and sales tax. Federal and state funding, of course, can grow or shrink based on, congressional or state legislature changes in formulas and changes in processes and so on. And then you all being kind of the locals being the other major source of revenue, are the other key contributors to this whole process. So thinking about what might your contributions need to look like in 2 or 3 years in order to fund this whole network. So what would be a fair way to split the costs, in future years, given these trends? Because it's, local dollars will likely need to be, or almost certainly need to be, increased in order to continue to afford this expanded network at no later than fiscal year 2025. So a couple of things that we want to talk about in terms of the structure of what is a fair way to split costs. So for any route in the system, there's an important aspect that we want to talk about, which is the importance of local buy-in for any route in the system, because you as local jurisdictions have a lot of levers that support successful transit. Your management of the streets, of signals, of curbs, of all of the things you do to manage streets has an enormous effect on the speed that GRTC can achieve on its routes, which ultimately has a big effect on the cost of any given service. You all have enormous control over the land use policy, particularly, density patterns around key corridors and regional corridors in particular, and therefore have an enormous potential impact on ridership on any of these routes, which can affect funding from the perspective of fare revenue potentially, if you do charge fares in the future, but also ridership affects your state and federal allocations. Higher ridership generally means you're going to get more state and federal funding. And then your land use and parking policies affect the cost and convenience of the alternatives to transit, which also affects ridership and therefore can affect your funding streams in both the fare side of the equation, if you have fares, and the federal state formula fundings. So one of the things we've been talking about internally is that if locals have no skin in the game on regionally funded services, there are fewer reasons to care about these issues on your end. So there's a strong sense that we want you all to at least have some skin in that game about the cost of service, for example, from the speed of service. And just to make sure everyone kind of understands what this really means, this is an animation of a bus route running every 10 minutes. It costs 4 buses to run because that is over that distance that this service is running, and at the speed these buses are running, you can run 10-minute service with 4 buses on this route. However, if there's more traffic congestion, if there's a change in the streets, you add new signals without thinking about how that might affect the bus service, it could be that you end up with the condition at the bottom, which is now those buses are going a lot slower. And now those 4 buses, because they're going slower, covering the same distance, you can only effectively provide 15-minute service with those same 4 buses. So the slower speed means you've effectively cut frequency and capacity by 33% on that corridor. This is really critical, and local decisions, and to some extent state decisions as well, depending on the corridor, can have a huge effect on speed. So this is a really key reason why we feel like it is really important for all of the locals to have at least a little bit of skin in that game about thinking about how funding of regional corridors. Any questions about that geometry of particularly speed, which is a big factor here? No? Okay, so because of this, GRTC is recommending that for regionally designated routes, that there be basically a regional local cost split. You can think about this as a lot of the cost splits you have in federal funding formulas and state funding formulas. There's almost always some local percent that still has to be provided in order to provide some skin in the game on all of these things. So at this point, GRTC is recommending a 90-10 split. So 90% of the cost of a regionally funded route, which we'll get to what qualifies, would be paid out of regional sources, the CVTA, Fed, and state buckets that we've talked about for a while. And then 10% would be paid by the local jurisdiction served. And we would split that local jurisdiction served by the quarter-mile service area around the stops of each route. So what that means is the more of a route is in your jurisdiction, then the more of that local percentage of that 10% you would be responsible for. So what routes are regional? This is an initial look at the possible regional designations of routes in the system. So the 1, 2, 3, the north-south relatively frequent trunk lines that branch out would be considered regional. And that includes today's Route 111, which we're proposing to incorporate into Route 3B. Route 4B, since it serves US 60 Williamsburg Road, a regional corridor, and crosses jurisdiction lines. Route 5, since it is a major spine east-west, again on a state highway on a radial corridor through downtown. Route 7 and all of its branches. Route 14, routes 18, 19, routes 18, 79, which of course right now are separate, but in the long term we're planning to merge into a large West End loop. Route 19, Route 20, 3 express routes, 29, 64, and 82X, because they are longer distance and higher productivity express services. Route 91, Laburnum, and then the new routes that we've drawn the newer extended routes that we've drawn between Richmond and Chesterfield and Southside, the 84, 85, 86 in the long-term plan. I'll just note, previously we had talked about possibly excluding orbital services like the 20 and the 91 from regional. Based on what I'll show you in a little bit, it does seem like we can designate them regional and still fit them within this funding structure. And ultimately, they do provide some significant value to the overall network in terms of the interconnectivity of radial and orbital services and connecting services across the region. So it does make a lot of sense to ultimately include them in the funding structure. What does this leave for what are regional routes? I mean, what are local routes? So the 4A, the 12, and the 13. So those are 3 more east end, almost entirely in the city of Richmond routes that don't really serve longer distance travel. They're relatively short, more circulation type routes within one particular area. Lower productivity express services, the 23, 26, 27, 28. Route 50, which is a local route, mostly in the city, that's kind of an underlying local access on Broad Street. The 56, which is a very low frequency connector route to industrial areas in Henrico. 76 and 78, which are low frequency, again, more of neighborhood type circulator routes in the western part of Richmond. 87 and 88 in South Richmond, which again are more neighborhood local circulator type routes. And same thing with Route 93. And then Route 95X is of course kind of a separate matter, being the Petersburg express route. So this is the initial thinking on splitting which routes are designated regional and which ones are local. Mostly thinking about which routes are serving longer distance trips across jurisdictions, even if the route doesn't directly cross jurisdiction lines. If it's on a major regional corridor over longer distances, it tends to qualify, we think. So any questions on those? Okay.
Yeah, Scudder, this is great. Thanks. I guess I had a question so CVTA TAC is going through similar discussions right now in terms of prioritization for other types of projects and ways to spend its money.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have an idea of like what a definition of regional is for transit, or is it more of a smell test? In the future, I'm thinking if one of these local routes has major characteristic changes or there's a new route proposed, is there something we can run down a checklist to say, well, it fits these criteria, so it's going to be regional?
Yeah, I think we can try to write a checklist of things that would indicate a route is likely to be regional. And that checklist is probably, is it serving is it primarily serving a major regional corridor, like a major regional radial corridor, like the main carry corridor? Even though the 5 doesn't really cross jurisdictional boundaries, that main carry corridor is a key, ultimately connecting major regional activities, significant regional activity centers. Or is it providing key connectivity between other radial corridors, which would be why you might say the 91 and the 20 qualify, because they're pretty long distance routes. They are, connecting other major regional corridors, and therefore serving an important transfer function across the network. Versus the routes that are here that are shown as more local routes, which tend to be much shorter, tend to be more local circulation within one or a few neighborhoods. So, I think we can write a kind of checklist of things that are likely indicators. At the end of the day, there is a little bit of a smell test reality. So that's, I think, Adrian, do you have any other thoughts?
No, I think we could definitely write, and you covered most of it. And I would say even if you wrote, like you said, a checklist, or even like, let's say it's a spreadsheet and went through and there are certain criteria and you checked it. But at the end, it still comes down to kind of prioritization. I would say another thing you didn't cover, let's say frequency is a big piece, and even productivity. I think those are a little bit more, they're quantitative, but I think a little bit more qualitative to say that it could be designed on a corridor, but it could be filtered out because of that.
Yeah, I think there's probably a series of attributes of where does the route go, how does it connect across the whole network, that you can use to help guide decision-making independent of any information about performance of the route. But then over time, you would also want to consider route performance as an aspect of whether or not something continues to be considered a regional route. And that gets to the thinking longer term. What if the funding structure of CVA changes and you have a whole lot more funding and you want to expand? Well, you wouldn't have performance information on newer expanded routes that you might draw. So you'd want some things that are more about just the attributes of how routes are connecting. Barb, you got a hand up?
Yeah, you mentioned that, in our workshops, we had said orbitals would not be considered regional.
Well, we were leaning that direction as we were kind of first thinking about this, and in large part because kind of in the priorities of things that might be regionally funded, they would probably be lower on the priority list compared to, major regional radial corridors. What we have, and I'll go into a little more detail here in a minute about, how do the dollars and cents break out using this approach. And what we found is we could still qualify those as regional and still kind of fit everything in to a reason, what we think is a pretty reasonable funding structure for everyone
Okay.
in terms of the breakdowns of costs. Does that make sense? If you had if you had a lot less money, then you would maybe not designate those orbital corridors.
Yeah, it's just funny to have gone through exercises where we've been told there's not enough money, there's not enough money. And now we're going to, now it's more like, well, there is more money.
Well, let me get to the money part in a second to talk about, so that everyone understands
Sure.
how far the money can go, basically.
But with the orbital ones, I know we kept saying that, and it was kind of more about the distance, right? But I mean, as far as their originally designed purpose, as far as like the 20, I'm gonna use that one more than the 90, 91. I mean, it connects the north of Richmond. It connects you to the Pulse, which is a major connection point, kind of is that north-south and east-west connection with basically diverting downtown. And it goes all the way to McGuire at the end, and it connects to a major south side transfer facility as well. So it's your major connecting point without having to go downtown. So that one I think you can definitely argue as a regional route. Similar with the 91, I mean, it connects Willow Lawn, that's a major transfer center, and then it is a east-west connector and is our main route that connects, I guess, Laburnum area and White Oak Village.
And there's an important distinction here between what routes, because what we were talking about in terms of regional expansion versus what we're talking about in the overall funding of things from the CVTA and federal state bucket of kind of regional funding sources. Because all along there's, we've been talking about effectively some of that bucket is paying for existing service. There's and most of our discussions I think about the orbital services in the design retreats has been about whether to fund expansions of service, and those corridors just didn't stand out relative to other options for radial service improvements. So let me just let me pause. Are there any other questions before I kind of jump into an example of how this might work for one route so everyone can kind of see the math? Okay. All right, so let's talk about Route 1. So Route 1, the entirety of Route 1 with all of its branches in the draft plan that we've drawn goes into Henrico, goes into Chesterfield. A lot of it is in Richmond. And if we look at the full extent of that route and how much it costs to operate that entire route, it is about 77,000 annual revenue hours of service. If we designate it as a regional route with 90% cost share for regional and 10% for local, this is how that would break out. 90% of the cost would be borne by the regional funding sources, CVTA, federal, state funding buckets. And then that 10% local portion would come 7% from Richmond, 1% from Henrico, and 2% from Chesterfield. And that is based on breaking down the area served by each segment of the route within each jurisdiction. So what does that mean in terms of the revenue hours per funding bucket? So that's 69,400 and some odd revenue hours in the regional funding bucket, about 5,200 in Richmond's, 1,000 in Henrico's, and about 1,300 in Chesterfield's bucket. And then if we then break that down to what does that mean in dollar terms? Of course, dollar terms are going to change from year to year because cost per revenue hour will vary. But based on the FY22, this upcoming fiscal year estimates of costs, which are $107.77 per revenue hour, that would mean regional funding would be supporting almost $7.5 million to support this route. We would be asking, GRTC would be asking the local contributors for about $570,000 from Richmond, about 112,000 from Henrico, and about 149,000 from Chesterfield to support that particular route. So we have broken down each route in the draft plan that we've drawn using this, approach of how much of the route's service by service area is in each jurisdiction, and then if it's regional, how much falls under regional classification, how much falls under local, based on that area served. Does that make sense to everyone? How that breaks down? Chet. Yep.
I think so. We are sharing this, so hopefully there are other folks that are watching. Can you talk a little bit more about area served and how is it a buffer? How's that calculated?
Yeah, so the area served calculation is done by taking the route that we've drawn, the route we've drawn in Remix. For existing routes, we know exactly where the stops are. For extended routes, we've made approximate estimates today of where stops might be, approximating probably about a quarter mile between stops. And then we take a straight crow's fly quarter mile buffer to then calculate the area around each stop. And then for each route or route portion, we then take that area for that route, divide it by each jurisdiction, and then the area within each jurisdiction divided by that total area for that route gives us that percentage breakdown by jurisdiction. We could get into doing a different way of calculating the area. Most of that's going to have a pretty marginal impact on the ultimate percentages. So good question. There's definitely some deep weed calculations here, but again, most of it has marginal changes. So any other questions on that? Okay. So what if, let's think about a scenario of if the entire expanded network were running in fiscal year 2022, and it cost $107.77 a revenue hour. And we use this new allocation model to allocate the costs across the regional funding sources and all the local funding sources. What would it break down to? What would we be asking for? So it would mean that about 475,000 revenue hours would be under the regional bucket and would be funding about $51 million in service. About 106,000 revenue hours would fall in the Richmond bucket of funding, about 28,000 in Henrico, about 6,000 in Chesterfield, and then Petersburg pays for the 95X. And if we multiply those revenue hours by that per revenue hour cost, that comes to about 11.4 million from Richmond, about 3 million from Henrico, and about 722,000 from Chesterfield for fixed route services. So that would be the breakdown for fixed route system-wide if we were running that whole network today and we were allocating costs using this approach. That's what we would be asking the partners for on the fixed route side.
So what that means is if we were to start the whole network July 1, which we know is not going to happen, but just to show what it would end up looking like.
So we're not asking for you to pony up this money on July 1st. We're simply showing you this scenario.
And this is Sharon with Henrico. So this would be additional to what we're already contributing, correct?
No.
No.
This would be what we would, if we were using this funding, system, this is what we would be asking for on the fixed route side. I'm going to get to another important point here, which is talking about paratransit, which is a related but still separate matter. And I see a quick question from Lorna about not seeing Route 111 on the regional or local list. So just to note, in case anyone missed that, Route 111, we are presuming in the draft plan is part of Route 3B and therefore is considered regional. So what about the other part of this? About 12% of GRTC's costs of its entire funding structure is going to paratransit service. And that's not an insignificant portion of the system. The Americans with Disability Act requires paratransit service be provided within 3/4 mile of local fixed route service in the system. So commuter express routes are excluded from that service area requirement. Currently Henrico and Richmond fund a discretionary program to provide additional service beyond that 3/4 mile service area. There are a few areas within the city of Richmond, just a few, that are not within 3/4 mile of a fixed route today. And there, of course, large portions of Henrico County are not within 3/4 mile. And both jurisdictions fund CARES Plus program, which provides that paratransit service across all of both jurisdictions, and sometimes beyond the minimum required time that you have to provide that service, because the ADA requirement only says you have to provide paratransit at the same hours that you are operating fixed route service. But the CARES Plus program goes above and beyond that. So there's a bit of nuance here between care service, which is really doing the work of meeting that minimum ADA requirement, which is estimated to be just about $5.9 million a year. And then the CARES Plus program, which is about $1.6 million a year to provide that extra service above and beyond ADA requirements. So there's a question, of course, of how to account for these costs. And historically, GRTC has charged each jurisdiction for the paratransit costs associated with trips to and from its jurisdiction. Chesterfield and Henrico in particular, you all have, I think, Adrian, you do invoices monthly for that. So there's a historical precedent here for saying that locals are ultimately responsible for the paratransit obligation that comes with service. If we maintain that expectation going forward, then GRTC would want to have CARES Plus costs assigned to the locality that is asking for that discretionary extra service, which is primarily Henrico right now, and then allocate the cost for the rest of the paratransit system across the service area of each jurisdiction. It's predicting ridership and predicting paratransit ridership is a very challenging thing, but we do know that paratransit ridership tends to track with population and jobs, because that's where people are, and that's the jobs are where they want to go because they want to go to medical appointments, they want to go to shopping, and those are kind of two of the primary things that the paratransit riders want to do. So if we look at it from the angle of how many people and jobs are in that 3/4 mile ADA paratransit service area around the local routes in the draft plan, then we find that about 45% of people and jobs combined are within the service area in Richmond, about 39% in Henrico, and about 15% in Chesterfield. So if we allocate paratransit costs across that breakdown between the jurisdictions, then that is an add-on to those fixed route costs and would get us to these numbers. So we have these fixed route costs in this column, the ones I just walked through 2 slides ago, that breaks down by route and by regional or local funding. And then we have the CARES and the CARES Plus costs. The CARES Plus costs being distributed approximately by the jurisdiction of where those trips are coming from and going to, which is mostly Henrico. So it's about $1.5 million a year. A little bit in Richmond, only $130,000. And then splitting the estimated cost of care service, which is just about $5.9 million a year, across the 3 jurisdictions by the percent of people and jobs. So roughly by the likely origin and destination points, would lead to about 2.7 million for Richmond, about 2.3 million for Henrico, and about 927,000 for Chesterfield, which would then lead to the total cost breakdown across all of these buckets over on the far right. 51 million for the fixed route costs across the regionally funded services, about 14.2 million, 14.3 for Richmond, about 6.9 for Henrico, about 1.6 million for Chesterfield, and then Petersburg paying for its express service. So this is, again, this is the scenario. This is not what we're asking people for this year, but if we could run the whole system, if we did apply this formula, this is what it would look like for fiscal year 2022. Ultimately, that draft plan that we've drawn is going to take probably 2 to 3 years to fully implement. And it is likely going to take a couple of years to transition to this new allocation formula to align everything with, this potential breakdown. The other thing to note, of course, is that generally costs are rising about 3 to 5% per year. So we should all think about these costs as this is FY22, but costs tend to be rising between 3 to 5% per year. So you would project these out 3 to 5% per year going forward to see what might this look like in 2025, for example. Darana.
And just to give sorry. Go ahead, Darana.
You can go ahead, Adrian.
I would say just to give some comparison to the Care Plus numbers, Richmond pays now kind of a trend year to year around a little over 3 million, and then Henrico pays somewhere around 3.5 for their Care Plus. So these numbers do track with what we've actually seen, even though he's done a projection.
Darona?
Yeah, I was just trying to figure out where are federal and state subsidies shown?
So federal and state subsidies are in this regionally funded bucket. So if we think about what's happening in this example cost allocation for Route 1. So federal and state subsidies are being incorporated into this regional cost allocation. So 90% of the cost of Route 1 is being covered by those regional sources as a regionally designated route. So the local cost distribution is therefore 7% to Richmond, 1% to Henrico, 2% for Chesterfield. If we think about this in terms of if this route was not considered a regional route and the local jurisdictions were asked to shoulder the full cost of this route, then you can basically multiply these numbers by 10 to get a sense of what would be the ask for these routes from the locals: 70% Richmond, 10% Henrico, 20% Chesterfield, along that line.
Yeah, and you may need to do that just for, I guess, consideration, because with the city of Richmond having, and then also maybe showing the additional miles that the enhancements would bring to the system. Because again, right now, I think with it looks like the city of Richmond is paying for solely with this model some of the local routes in which federal and state funds are eligible to subsidize.
So the model means that federal and state dollars are all being put into this regional bucket. But a sizable portion of that regionally funded service is in the city. So, we can talk more in detail about how much of that is in this, how much of the regionally funded service is in different jurisdictions. But the flip side of that is then things that are considered locally funded, everyone who is paying for locally funded service is then being asked to pay for the fully allocated cost. So that is one way this is different.
And Richmond drives the federal, and Richmond's local service drives that federal and state subsidy. And I don't understand it then being spread out amongst localities that don't drive it. And then because the miles aren't there in those localities, and I'm not saying that there's not a fair amount of regional routes listed, What I'm saying is all routes contribute to the formulas for state and federal, and that I don't agree with it being applied solely to the regional pot, especially with Richmond contributing heavily to that formula with those miles.
Okay. Sharon, you have a question?
Yes, I just had a question with the scenario you had up with, would Henrico be reduced coverage for care service? With that scenario, we'd still have the same coverage for care as we do now?
Yeah, the assumption here is that you would maintain your Care Plus program at a similar level, which is where this 1.5 million for the Cares Plus service area cost is coming from. And then the care program, within 3/4 of a mile would cost approximately $2.3 million. That care program, there will probably be, again, this is somewhat of a simplistic projection at this point, but it is likely that over time this Cares Plus may go down a little bit and the care will go up a little bit, because as there's expanded service, say with the 1879, for example, that route would then be putting more of your service area and more of your service time periods under the care program as opposed to Cares Plus.
So are we limiting it? Go ahead.
I say same with your Route 1. Now that you go further north, you'll capture a great amount within care, and your Care Plus would shrink.
Okay, but like right now we go more than 3/4 of a mile out, right? For the care service?
That's the Cares Plus.
With Cares Plus, yeah, we
Cares
go
Plus,
out,
yeah.
but like, I guess existing now, the care coverage, I thought it expanded. You could use paratransit or regular care outside 3/4 of a mile of our regional service, and they didn't have to use Care Plus. Is that correct, or?
Adrian?
You have to charge the same, so I think the customer may not know necessarily the difference, but as far as what's federally required, it's just the care. But you guys do offer the care and Care Plus, and it's the same service area. I mean, regardless, all of Henrico is covered in both of these models.
Okay, that answers it. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Good.
Any other questions?
This is Ken Lance. I just had a question about Chesterfield. I was wondering what sort of assumptions you made concerning the Access Chesterfield service.
Well, the presumption is that that will still exist, and that will certainly capture some trips, even within care service areas. I would imagine, however, that there will, I mean, Adrian can speak to the experience of what's been happening around the Route 111, but there has been growing usage of care service in and around the 111th 3/4 mile service area since that route came online. And you can imagine, for folks, the reasoning for that, of course, is that with the expansion of GRTC service into that area, care will take you from, somewhere along Route 1 down there to downtown, to, to Weston hospitals, to other places that Access Chesterfield can't take you. So there is, likely to be some significant care usage, I would imagine, in the Chesterfield area.
Yeah, and I think cost plays an important factor, especially now, but even in the future, since our care service is currently free, so it's complimentary to our fixed route. And then Chesterfield, they have, was it $6 each way for care, so that'll probably play an important factor in use.
Okay. Any other questions about this breakdown? So I think the biggest potential concern I hear then is, Dorana, your thoughts about whether we should split out federal state from CVTA in this regional funding scheme to apply, if I'm hearing you correctly, to apply federal and state funding subsidies effectively to all routes, whether regional or local. Is that what I'm hearing?
That could be one way, and or proportional to the percentage of routes of the system.
I think if she just saw it broken down, I think it helps just see the whole picture of what jurisdictions and how much of the, whether it's miles or hours, and what's covered. I mean, in the Route 1 model, for example, even though it's in that bucket, what the federal and state basically is doing is it's decreasing the local required contribution already per route. I think I went through quickly, I think 14 of what's a 42, 43 routes are City of Richmond. But again, that's not helpful because it's not necessarily you can't see the hours.
Right.
So maybe if we apply that to you, Dorona, it might help, I guess, paint the whole picture of what's already kind of split. But a lot of that, since the City of Richmond, I mean, is pretty much the majority of the regional in terms of service hours, you are getting kind of the largest federal and state piece of the bucket as well to decrease the total required local subsidy. But yeah, it's not in the presentation, so we can break that down.
But decreasing the local subsidy on the regional routes.
Well, I mean, yes, that's the way that it's broken down, but I mean, I think you would end up with this very similar picture whether you put it in local or regional.
And I think
well, but I think, I mean, just naturally, if there's a subsidy being applied to the 90%, and then that percentage is different, the spread of the local amount to each of the localities would be higher, and maybe just not based on the other percentages that you put on there. But yeah, I would need to see it applied. I would need to see it in other formats for me to really support one or the other.
Can you go to the next slide, Scudder? Or sorry, if you want to.
This one or the example cost allocation?
This one, I just wanted to see of this, let's see, 4A, 12. Yeah, was it eight of these are City of Richmond. And I mean, these are honestly like your shortest routes.
Yeah.
So in terms of miles and hours, I mean, the majority of it is regional. These are honestly your shortest routes that you have.
Well, I mean, my bottom line is, you know, the $14 million price tag, and I'm going to have to understand that when I'm just going to have to better understand it.
Yeah. So this is ultimately probably a follow-up direct conversation, Dorona, with you and possibly others at the city to explain that it is potentially possible to break out a different funding stream that would apply federal and state subsidies to these routes on the local column as well. I think everyone obviously needs to understand that obviously there's only so much CVTA money. So the more we break down, say, the federal state portion to these local routes, the larger that local cost share request is probably going to be on these regional routes, or fewer of what's in this list of regional routes would be designated as regional and would then fall into the local funding bucket. So, there's different ways we can break this down. And my best guess at this point is that even if we made a big change in that way we designate federal and state funding as opposed to CVTA funding, to make the breakdown work across the costs and the funding sources that we have, would still probably result in a stream that puts people relatively close to these numbers. They might be $1 million or $2 million more one way or the other, but this is likely still going to end up being the ballpark range of things, would be my guess. So we can go into a lot more detail with you, Dorona, about how this is being calculated right now, and look at an alternative as well. But my guess is that it's still going to end
And
up.
also, where is the pulse?
Oh, did I not put that in the regional list? It's in the regional list. It's definitely in the regional list. I promise you it is. I just did not put it on here. It is definitely regional. My apologies. Thank you for catching that. Okay. Any other questions? Okay. So the other thing to talk about, so what we're okay, we're about in 30 minutes left. How might this service be phased in? We just want to go over kind of quickly initial thinking about phasing service in over time. We can't, get the dozens and dozens of operators and whatnot in the door to start this service on July 1st, obviously. So we have some initial thinking about tiers of rolling this out. We don't really have a definitive idea yet about the exact timing of that, but about which things might come first and then second and so on in a rollout process over this timeline of implementation. So what we've looked at is grouping some of these into basically 4 tiers of expansions or improvements to put things together that are connected, because some of these improvements are connected to each other, and also put things in manageable groups of the numbers of additional operators and buses that you need to have before you roll them out. So tier 1 thinking would be the Route 29X to Innsbruck, which may actually be something that can be done, in 6 months, or not this next service change, but possibly the service change after that, which would be when, Adrian?
September,
because that does not require any additional buses or operators. It's just about 750 additional revenue hours. It's really a change in the schedule that could be implemented pretty quickly. Other things in this tier would be folding Route 111 into Route 3B, which probably takes just 1 additional operator in order to provide the expanded Sunday service. Maybe 2, but it's only 1,000 additional revenue hours. Extending Route 1A to Chesterfield and extending Route 1C to Brook and Parham. Those would be the things in tier 1 of the expansion. These would add up to about 15 additional operators, which is our initial estimate. Adrian and her team are still going through that. So that would be, the Route 29 improvement, which does have some value for people trying to get from the city to suburban jobs by providing that reverse commute access to the West Broad corridor. And then the 1C improvement expansion to Brook and Parham. And then the Midlothian extension to Chesterfield Town Center, and folding the Route 111 into Route 3B so that you have more 1-seat rides in that corridor, and also a Sunday service on that corridor. Tier 2 expansion would be turning up the Route 5 to every 10-minute service, consolidating the 77 into that. This, we don't think, takes any additional buses because of the removal of Route 39. The consolidation of Route 77 would not necessarily require additional buses, but might require up to 5 additional operators because of the additional revenue hours of service. Extending Route 3 to Laburnum and 3A to Azalea and Chamberlain would be in this tier, and then the improvement of the frequency of Route 7C to every 15 minutes would be in this tier. So this would provide improvements with the Route 5 would be a significant improvement within the city. The Route 3 extension would provide some significant improvement in access for people on the north side of the city, and also along Meadowbridge and Azalea in Henrico. And the Route 7 improvement would provide a lot of access improvements, frequency improvements for folks along that corridor in the city and in Henrico. Tier 3 would be increasing the frequency of Route 19 to every 20 minutes, which is only one additional bus, but does add potentially 4 to 6 additional operators. Again, this is just an initial estimate on that. It requires more operators, one, because this includes not just the frequency improvement, but it also does include some span improvement and more service on Sunday and evenings and on Saturdays and weekdays to provide the same span of service as other similar routes across the network. Today, I think Sunday service doesn't start until 10 a.m. Is that right, Adrian? On the 19?
Right.
Yeah. So this would move the start time up to, I think, 6 a.m., which would align with most of the rest of the network. And then the other priority in this tier would be Route 86 extension into Chesterfield and the new Route 84. These two are tied together because they are connected to each other. So this is, a significant improvement on Broad Street frequency, which has a big effect on west end of Henrico, but also a big improvement in access to jobs for people trying to get out to that corridor, which includes a lot of people from the city potentially. The 84 and 86 improvements are tied together because this 86 route extension, as drawn in the draft network you see here on the right, is moving existing service from Broad Rock over to Hopkins Road in the city. And so we need Route 84 to be brought online at the same time in order to maintain service on Broad Rock as we do this redesign of Route 86. So those two need to come together, which is why those are together in this tier. And then tier 4 expansion would be the increased frequency and development of that West End loop in Henrico on the 1879, and then the Route 85 to Chesterfield Government Center, which would provide significant improvements to access to all the hospitals in the West End of Henrico, and the Route 85 extension to the Government Center in Chesterfield, providing new access to the Route 10 corridor. I realized the one thing I didn't mention in these tiers is that the tier 1 expansion, one of the connected items is when this 1A route extension is rolled out through the Midlothian corridor, that would also bring along with it the changes to Route 2B and Route 1B along Warwick and Hull in the city, which would bring 30-minute service to the section of Hull Street in the city between Chippenham Mall and Southwood Apartments, which would be a nice and positive improvement for people in that corridor. So this connected set of improvements has some positive benefits, both in significant positive benefits in Chesterfield and also in south side of the city. So that's our initial thinking on the tiered expansion, again, to try to put things into buckets of reasonable size of numbers of operators needed, and roughly what we think is priority based on conversations we have. But this is the time to kind of have that general discussion about, are these things kind of in the right priority order given what you all think is most important for the region? So what questions do you all have about that initial thinking? None? You love it? No one has questions. Does everyone understand it? Does it make sense how this is organized? Ken?
Scudder, not so much looking at the tiered expansion, but where does expansion of BRT service fit in with this, or does it fit in?
There's no funded expansion of BRT service in this plan. Everything, the dollars have been spent, effectively at this point on everything else that we've drawn. There is, I think in the next planning phase that the DRTC in the region does in the strategic plan, that might be an opportunity to think about that more.
Okay.
Yeah, we're looking to do studies hopefully in the next year of what that next phase would be, Ken.
Okay, thanks, Adrian.
Mm-hmm.
Barb, you have a question?
So what would the timing be for the Route 1A extension to Chesterfield Town Center?
We are targeting, and again, this is again, as Scudder said, as far as resources and operators, but January we're looking at is hopefully being able to do kind of the phase 1 expansion.
I'm just thinking, you know, we have that technical grant, so we could work out details between now and January with that. And, you know, if it weren't for the CVTU funding, the plan would have been to do the study and then seek a demo grant. So I'm just trying to figure out all of that.
Right. I mean, it is a regional need. You guys have identified it yourself. So when you already applied for you got it in FY21, the grant, right? And you're just working on the actual, getting it all set up.
We just have a study grant right now. We didn't make an application
Okay.
this year for any DRPT stuff.
Got it. Okay. So it's for the study. And you're kicking that off soon? Okay. So
Yeah. If I weren't in this meeting, I'd be kicking it off.
Okay, perfect.
So, any other questions about this initial tier thinking? And I'll just quickly flip through the listing of them as anyone thinks of additional questions. I see a question in the, oh, sorry.
Sorry, this is Barb again. So, I mean, it would certainly benefit the region if we could take advantage of demo grant funding as much as possible. You know, so for the 84 and 86 and the 85, you know, that's what we'll try to do for those, is try to go through that process like we have, or we did with Route 1.
Yeah, I mean, if we think about it in terms of if you got demo grant funding, that could potentially move this up to an earlier tier if you know that grant came through earlier in the process of rolling out these improvements. The other thing is that you know, you all can have a conversation about these demo grants being a way to effectively displace the need for, you know, regional funding of these routes for, you know, the 2 or 3 years these run. And you know, that funding could then be allocated towards some capital priorities, for example, for a couple of years, because you wouldn't want to allocate that necessarily to other service, because, you know, then in a couple of years when the demo grant goes away, you would have to cut those routes in order to keep everything running. But it is a useful way potentially to extend your dollars to be able to cover particularly capital priorities for a couple of years.
And what you just said, Scudder, has been a concern of mine, which is our system's going to evolve and change. Our land uses are going to evolve and change. Densities. So what we're looking at today that is considered regional and funded, you know, is it every year we're going to take stuff off and put new stuff on, you know, because this route was productive when there were only 5 other routes to compare it to. But now it's not. How are we going to deal with adjusting as we go?
There's always an annual process through your TDP to review performance, and that's part of the reason you have service guidelines and performance measures. I would encourage everyone, though, to think about this structure, this whole network that you're building out as a structure that you should probably commit to trying to maintain as much as possible for, at least 2 or 3 years. When you roll out a new route, it takes a couple of years for ridership to really emerge. The 19 extension to short pump is still seeing growth in ridership in some sections of the corridor. And during the pandemic free fare, it's actually seen a substantial increase in ridership. So, if the 1A extension to Chesterfield doesn't have fantastic ridership in the first year, I don't think that's a reason to say, go back and cut it. Some of these corridors need time to emerge.
Yeah, I think 2-3 years is too short.
Yeah.
But in a big picture way, I'm saying, in the region's going to change over 10 years.
Mm-hmm.
And this will be woven into our TSP, in which we plan on doing in the next year or two. And I mean, that's a 10-year outlook. And you guys will all be at the table and we'll be looking at things like land use, changes in density, any other economic development opportunities that you guys have planned. And we'll hopefully be prepared for that when we develop it and have outlook. I mean, the TDP, we did that in 2018, and 4 or 5 years now. And I mean, there's only so much that has even changed since then. For the most part, the routes haven't really changed. I mean, we're having the opportunity to look at them again now, and now we're redoing the TSP or TDP next year. So it'll be the same process that we've always done.
And, thinking about growth of the region, the region is growing. There's new development happening. There's, redevelopment happening. But even 10 or 15 years from now, probably something like 90% of the density of the region 10 years from now, 15 years from now even, is where it is today, realistically. The growth and change is happening, but I don't expect it to dramatically alter what you would do 10 or 15 years from now. But we have planning processes to make sure that we are changing the things that make sense to change over time.
I'll be coming to you every year, Barb.
Which is just another long-winded way of me saying, transit networks are, the core of transit networks tend to be pretty permanent, and probably generally should be mostly pretty permanent in their, their overall structure, at least the major corridors. Okay. I see Lisa had a question a while back. I apologize, Lisa, but you were asking about the newest relief bill and the additional funding. I think we have some initial estimates of how much of that is coming in. Adrian might be able to speak more directly to that. Julie went over that at the board meeting.
Yes, and Scudder, I assume that any new revenues would be included in that regional share along with the other federal dollars.
Well, right now, all of that.
In your illustration. Yeah.
Well, all of this, and I should go back to this to make sure everyone knows. So these numbers on revenues and expenditures were developed in January. So they do not include the most recent relief numbers. And I think the thing to keep in mind is that, of course, that's a 1-year thing, or it's a one-time thing. And what we're trying to do in this cost allocation process is make sure that we are coming up with a cost allocation process that works going forward for multiple years as a guideline. But Adrian, and you have more probably to say about what are the priorities for that incoming relief funding.
Yeah, like you said, Julie went over it kind of as starting to think about it coming in and how we're going to allocate it at our last board meeting. So we're still going through that process, but we've already identified some uses for those funds within the next year. So they're not being incorporated into these numbers at this time.
I think big picture, that latest funding and this care surplus are part of the things that provide a cushion for you and the region to get from your current local funding model to whatever the eventual final breakdown is of what these numbers look like 2 or 3 years from now.
But they
because
could- I don't know what the restrictions are on any of those funds that might be coming, but you were talking about the surplus possibly going to the transit, the transfer stations, or at Willow Lawn and Southside. You know, possibly there could be some additional funds that would be available to go toward those projects.
yeah, and that's one of the reasons why we want to have this conversation about this eventual cost allocation for service, because if you use the entirety of this, this surplus is something we've talked about using as a bridge to get everyone to that eventual local service cost allocation. If you use all of that to help cushion the transition to everyone's increase in local dollars spent, then that money is gone. It's spent on service over the next, say, 3 years, or 4 years, however long that transition period is. If you don't spend it all, if localities transition to this cost model and everyone's kind of on par in, say, 2 years or 3 years, then you leave some of this surplus that you could spend on capital priorities, for example, like downtown transit center, Southside Transit Center, and other capital improvements. Any other questions? So it sounds like the most significant follow-up is, Dorona, we'll need to come back to you to go into more detail about all of this calculation as we've done it now, and possible alternatives. And if we come up with some possible alternatives, we'll come back to this group with that as well to talk about the potential differences in this cost allocation. Sounds like most everyone is generally comfortable with the tiers we've got laid out for implementation. So we'll move forward with putting those in the draft plan and coming up with a more clear timeline of when those tiers might happen. And then we will be moving very, very quickly to draft this plan, because we need to come back to the TPO and eventually CVTA really by the end of May, I think. Is that right, Adrian?
Yeah, we want to come, I think, to the TAC in April, and then we'll go to the policy board following. I think that's how it's scheduled. So something's happening in April. We're definitely going to our board with the draft plan, and then the finals will be done in May. So we only got 2 months left.
All right. Well, I want to just thank everyone again for the work so far in coming up with this draft network. I think it will be a great improvement for the region. And now we obviously are getting into the nittier-grittier details about how to make it all financially workable. So I guess I am done. I'll throw it back to Chet, I think, are there other items on the agenda to touch on for the working group?
We don't have other items other than, Adrian, do you have thoughts on ways to best utilize the working group between now and taking something to TAC? Review, fine tuning, things that the group can do to help continue the process.
Yeah, I mean, we'll set up something with Dorona. If anyone else wants to have a more in-depth meeting, just of course, let us know. I'd look at the actual schedule. April 13th, which is, I guess, the next TAC meeting, is when we want to bring this to TAC. And then it would go to, I guess, the recommendation from that would then go to the policy board on May 6th is what we're looking at. So if you want to give comments to us, we can definitely address them, but we can also discuss them in the actual TAC meeting.
Look like
this is
Barb had her hand up. Sorry, go ahead, Sharon.
Could you share the presentation with us or post it on the website? That'd be great. Thank you.
Yeah, we'll get it to Chet and have him posted.
Barb, did you have a question? I saw your hand raised.
Yeah, I'll need a individual meeting to understand the money better.
Sounds good. Enrico, do you want one as well?
Yes, please. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay. So is there, I guess we could talk offline about this, but is there a need for, I guess there's not much time. There's no need for this group to get together between now and the TAC meeting. Unless there's anything that you want to clarify before we get there.
I guess unless something significant comes up in the jurisdictional meetings, I don't see a need for us to get back together. We've covered expansion. We've gone over the base system allocation. That should get us to, they're going to get busy now getting the actual draft plan together. So we'll have something to react to by the TAC meeting.
Right. Okay. So I guess if it's okay with everybody else, we will we'll reserve the right to schedule a meeting if something comes up in the jurisdictional individual discussions. Otherwise, we will not schedule a follow-up meeting for this group until after the TAC meeting in April, and see what the outcomes of that are before we decide when to schedule the public transportation work group again.
And now that we
Everybody okay
actually
with
have,
that? Yeah, go ahead, Adrian.
just wanted to know there's going to be another level of phase 2 public engagement, and we plan on kicking that off. Hopefully by the end of this week, it'll be another survey as well as a public meeting. So there'll be opportunities for the public to give feedback as well.
Excellent, and we'll distribute that to this group as well, so you can share it with all of your constituents. Okay, I don't believe we have other business today. As I said, we'll hold off on scheduling a next meeting for this group, and encourage you all to tune into the TAC meeting on April 13th, and we will hope for good discussion and lots of great engagement for the TAC. So thank you all for your time. Thanks, Adrian. Thanks, Scudder. Thanks, Lorna and Nick, and everybody else who's been putting time into developing this plan. Without any other business, I think we can adjourn and move on about our days.
Yeah. Thank you
Thanks,
all.
everybody.
Thanks.
Thank you, Chet.